take the place of what had come before. They sold off lots of state-owned factories and other companies. They lowered the barriers to foreign investment. They shifted the focus of social subsidies from investment, like things like education that pay off in the long term, to things that just keep a lid on discontent, like subsidizing food staples and fuel. In this period, a small circle of businessmen, many with blood ties to the regime, became ridiculously wealthy as the regime chipped away at the public sector. The quality of public services deteriorated further and further. Society became more and more unequal. The quest for a decent standard of living was harder and harder. And basically all of the constituencies, all of the sort of social strata that the regime had appealed to with its authoritarian bargain in the 60s and 70s were now profoundly alienated by these changes in how the regime was governing. And it is those groups, particularly in the provinces, that revolted. This revolt, which in the beginning was a largely peaceful, nonviolent uprising, was so broad-based and leaped so quickly from one area of Syria to another that the regime's days really did seem to be numbered. If we can, oh, sorry, I have it. Oh. Okay, well, we don't need to see that previous slide. This is a Syrian political cartoonist, a very famous guy by the name of Ali Farzat, who drew this cartoon in 2011, and this is Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, and he's pulling off the days of the calendar, shielding his eyes because he doesn't want to see the next one is going to be the day that you go. So why is it, then, that the regime has survived so far? Well, there was a rapid resort by the regime to extreme and brutal violence, much more brutal than what was used in Tunisia and Egypt, and we have to say now even more brutal than what was used by Gaddafi in Libya. Such demonstrative symbolic violence as the killing of Ibrahim Kashush, the murder of Hamza al-Khatib, a 14-year-old boy whose body was returned to his parents with his genitals severed and stuffed in his mouth, and then was defamed in state-run media as a rapist. There was a blackout on information, not just on state-run media, but also on foreign media, which was effectively gagged for the first couple years of what was happening. And so for a long time, it was very difficult to even form an accurate picture of what was going on. And this had not just a disorienting effect on those outside, but it had a disorienting effect on the Syrian rebels, protesters themselves, because what they saw on the street in one part of Syria clashed dramatically with what they saw, the images of total quiet and normal commerce that they saw on state-run TV. And you could literally see two Syrias in the same day because these places are not far away. Another factor is that in contradistinction to Tunisia and Egypt, where you had very homogeneous societies united behind simple goals, and that caused cracks in the regime, in Syria you've had the obverse, where you have had a very unified, coherent regime facing a divided society and playing very heavily and relentlessly on those divisions. This is a map of Syria that shows how diverse the country is ethnically and religiously. I don't want to, there's no reason to get into who's who and all of that, but these different colors correspond to, there are majorities of, say, Kurds in the north, majorities of Sunni Muslims in the center, and majorities of Druze down there in the south, in that purple there. Syria is an incredibly diverse country, like Lebanon, like Iraq. The regime has, for a long time, played on the idea that it and only it can be the guardian of a secular vision for Syria, and a vision in which all Syrians, regardless of whether they're Kurdish or Sunni or Druze or Christian, that all Syrians are equal in that they are Syrian citizens. The regime has presented itself as that kind of force. At the same time, it has hinted that were it to ever be displaced, what would automatically come after it would be a tidal wave of sectarianism, right? The regime has played this game for a long time, and it has been successful at sowing those fears in the population, particularly in minority populations like the Alawi community, which most of the top regime figures is drawn from. And unfortunately, largely because of the regime's own sectarian behavior, this has become somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy in Syria today. And we have the opposition, the armed opposition from 2012, really before then, actually engaging in brutal sectarian attacks just as bad as what the regime was doing. And so these fears seem realistic particularly to the minority communities in Syria. So what we have, the result is that important sectors of the population will not abandon the regime, not out of any love for the regime, but out of loathing for the alternatives. Additionally, the regime has the firm backing of what my colleague Bassem Haddad calls its business backbone. These are the elite merchants and industrialists, many of them with blood or family ties to the Assads, who benefited most from the social market economy of 2005 forward. They are tied to the regime not just by mutual benefit, but also by mutual guilt, because they know that Syrians hold them equally responsible for what the regime has done. The result is a balance of weakness, with neither side strong enough to achieve victory. The state is dissolving, the regime is becoming a purely military entity with no political power, but there is no single force that is coherent enough to challenge it. It reminds one of nothing so much as this other cartoon by Ali Farzad, which brought to my mind a quote from Frederick Douglass: "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." And here we have a political prisoner, literally with a ball and chain, confronting the dictator who is symbolically chained to his throne. The dictator has to stay on the throne or else, right? So in this weird way, the dictator is as bound by the political system as the people that he rules. In Egypt as well, the powers that be have resorted to extreme violence to preserve their privileges. Everything from the infamous virginity tests, rapes of women protesters in Tahrir Square, to the coup staged by the Egyptian army on July 3rd, and to the massacres of supporters of the ousted President Mohamed Morsi on August 14th and what has come afterward. But in Egypt as well, there has been co-optation as well as coercion. There is the example of Kamal Abu Ita, the labor activist that I mentioned earlier. And for the time being, because of the mistakes that Morsi and the Muslim Brothers made while they were in power, this idea that the people in the army are one hand is kind of dominant, certainly in the Egyptian media, both state and private, but also among a big swath of public opinion, particularly educated middle-class public opinion, with the added complication of the manipulation of tensions between Muslims and Coptic Christians that also, as in Syria, make the army in Egypt appear to be the only responsible guardian of a secular vision of Egypt. So the picture in Egypt is dark as well. The polarization, the level of polarization there is the worst that I've ever seen. But I want to argue that there is also some hope there, as in Syria as well, and I'll come to that at the end. In Egypt, there is a deep streak of hostility to authority of all kinds. And this streak shows up in different ways depending on the time, place, and social stratum you're talking about. But perhaps its essence can be captured in the terms laid out by Diane Singerman in her classic study, Avenues of Participation, that of an absolute, unbridgeable gap between people, quote unquote, and government, shab and hukuma in Arabic. Most Egyptians have been socialized to believe that government is an innately self-serving entity, something that continually tries to extract resources while offering little in return, something that makes and remakes rules arbitrarily, and something that cannot be trusted to act in good faith. This attitude comes through in everything from the meager participation in elections in the pre-uprising era to how ordinary Egyptians approach the task of getting a driver's license. The last thing that you would ever do is actually go to the DMV, the Cairo version of the DMV, and stand in line and fill out an application and wait for your driver's test, because you just don't trust that that system is set up to work for you. So you do just about anything else. You meet a friend of a friend who happens to be a police general, and you slip him a little bribe. You do something. You do just about anything you can, except by doing things the proper way. A corollary of this attitude is that government, hukuma, owes the people for all of its depredations, and therefore the people is entitled to get what it can by any means, licit or illicit, like tapping into electricity lines without being registered to pay. For the masses of urban poor who do not have much to do with formal politics, activities like this are basically a weapon of the weak, a form of tacit politics that isn't quite resistance, but isn't accommodation to the status quo either. And this disdain is extended to the entire political class, including the establishment, opposition political parties, and a lot of intellectuals and so on. It's a mood that one Egyptian scholar has identified as anti-hegemony. He says, a mood whereby people refuse to identify with the programs of ruling elites. In short, a system of authority losing legitimacy. It is important, of course, not to lapse from there into some kind of romance of the barricades. The people want the fall of the regime, yes, and that is something to be applauded. But unfortunately, we've seen in Egypt this summer that sometimes the people can want ugly things. On the other hand, if Egypt really is characterized by this attitude of anti-hegemony, then it would be a mistake, an analytical mistake, to say that the popular support for the coup this summer is proof positive that the people will always want ugly things. Rather, the tumult after the coup shows that no single political force has won the day. The political field is open and contested because there is no critical mass of Egyptians that is captivated by any of the visions that are on offer. It's conventional to talk a great deal about the polarization of Egypt, in Egypt, and of Egypt, as between secular liberal forces and Islamist ones, or between the supporters of the brothers and supporters of the army. But I'd like to offer an alternative view that is a view that's more from below. And I think this is a more historical view, and hence one that's more likely to be predictive of the future. On the social level, away from this formal politics, who controls the government, who's the president, the spirit of protest remains very much alive. In 2012, if we look at labor activism, the wave of strikes that crested in the 2000s actually crested higher. There were 5 times as many strikes in 2012 than in any year of the 2000s. And I emphasize again, those strikes are not just bread and butter, things. They are innately political in Egypt because strikes are illegal. And there are also countless instances of neighborhood protest on the level of individual neighborhoods about everything from the government trying to seize lucrative land to build 5-star hotels and displace poor residents, to trash removal, to the provision of first aid, to having safe crosswalks, and so on. These sort of local struggles, whether they're in workplaces or in neighborhoods, are what one might refer to as little Tahrir squares that are ongoing all across the country every day. And I'm not saying that they could, by some iron law of history, coalesce into another big Tahrir that is going to once again revive the spirit of 2011 in Egypt. But it's that the possibility of that exists because society remains in a state of turmoil, and because there is a powerful and recent memory of people facing down the police state and winning, and that does not disappear overnight. The question is whether that old and deep spirit of anti-hegemony, hostility toward political authority, will assert itself over this polarization at the level of formal politics, and if so, how soon? In Syria as well, though the situation is probably bleaker than Egypt, certainly bleaker than Egypt, there are still reasons for hope. And the reason for hope is that there is no military victory for anybody in Syria. The regime will never control the entirety of the territory again. The armed opposition is presently too weak and disorganized to control the whole territory itself. Outside powers, everyone from Russia to the United States to regional powers like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Iran, are intervening, each to back their own private horse. As I was talking about with Dr. Khoury earlier, the opposition has sort of degenerated in many cases into a series of, or a coalition of warlords that doesn't have any kind of unified command. So the situation is bleak, but because there's a balance of weakness, the only solution is a political one. And eventually, all the parties will realize that there is no victory and that there must be a political solution of some kind. And there are, and always have been in Syria, people who have a genuinely, not just anti-sectarian, but positively pluralist vision for a future Syria. Those people used to organize themselves as what were called the local coordination committees in towns across the country. Many of them are still there, many of them are still at work. These people need to be given space by an immediate ceasefire that should be sought by the outside powers to do their political work, to do the work of healing the country that will be required before this country can emerge from its long nightmare. Which brings us back to the geostrategic picture. Let's zoom back out to conclude. True to form, the United States has backed stability, quote unquote, in its ally, Egypt. So it has backed the government, no matter who it was, Mubarak until he fell, then the Brotherhood, then the army after the coup.